My grandmother told me a scary bedtime story. Years later, I found out that the story she told me was horrifyingly true. I watched from a distance while my grandma and grandpa fished on their lake in the backyard, but one thing confused me. While grandpa cast his line and watched his rod, waiting for the anticipating tug of a fish, grandma's gaze remained fixed across the lake, her head tilted intently towards the dark fringe of woods. I never saw her look at the bobbing lures. She didn't even seem interested in fishing at all. I thought that maybe she just simply enjoyed looking at the trees. But a nagging feeling persisted. There was more to her gaze than a simple love for nature. It was summer break, and I decided to spend it at my grandparents' house in Knoxville, Tennessee. They lived in a 2-story house, recently built in 2018. It connected directly to a lake, with a dock jutting out on the far right side where my grandpa kept his bass boat. My grandparents were a sweet and quiet couple. They kept to themselves most of the time, living a peaceful life in their little corner of the world. Every summer, though, my visits became a tradition. Grandma's invitation was always an automatic yes, her warm smile and gentle voice a beacon calling me back. There were countless things to love about my grandma, her kindness and generosity at the top of the list. If I wanted something, it was usually an automatic yes from her too. But one of the things I truly cherished most was her stories. Unlike Grandpa, who mostly stuck to tales of his time in the military, exciting stories filled with bravery and adventure, of course, Grandma was a bottomless well of stories. Whether it was a funny story from her childhood, a heartwarming story about a kind neighbor, or a fantastical bedtime story that transported me to magical lands, Grandma always had one on hand. She was one of those special grandmas who could weave a story from thin air, her words painting vivid pictures in my mind. Grandpa, on the other hand, was a man of few words. A quiet strength emanated from him, and the stories he did tell were always about his service. He'd talk about the places he'd been, the challenges he'd faced, and the lessons he'd learned. While not as fantastical as Grandma's stories, they held a different kind of magic, a testament to his resilience and the experiences that shaped him. One of the things I always admired about Grandpa was his outdoor skills. He'd tell me most of his knowledge came from his military training, jokingly saying they prepared him for anything. He was a true outdoorsman, the kind of person I'd trust implicitly if we were ever lost in the wilderness. He knew everything about fishing, the best spots on the lake, the best techniques to catch different types of fish. Some of my favorite memories were spent on his boat, cutting through the cool morning water, the sun rising over the horizon, and the gentle hum of the motor a comforting lullaby. Every night, Grandma dipped into her seemingly endless well of stories. I never quite understood how she did it. Her mind was like a sprawling library, shelves overflowing with stories to tell. One night, she'd tell me a story of brave knights seeking vengeance, their swords gleaming in the sun. Another night, she'd tell me a story of a land shimmering with magic spells and cursed lands. Then there were the scary stories. Now, Grandma usually avoided them. She knew how they affected me. But the thing about those stories was the detail. Oh man, the detail. They were so vivid, so real, it felt like I was peeking through a crack into another world. A world where the monsters and creatures she described lurked. A world so terrifying that I felt like falling through that crack would kill me. Every night was the same routine. Nestled under a patchwork quilt in the guest room, I'd wait with bated breath. The soft click of the doorknob was my cue. Grandma, her face etched with a lifetime of stories, would enter, a gentle smile gracing her lips. She'd pull up a rocking chair, its rhythmic creak adding to the lullaby effect. Then, in a warm voice, she'd begin telling me a story. One night, though, tucked under the patchwork quilt, I waited for Grandma's nightly visit. The soft click of the doorknob announced her arrival. "Ready for another story?" she asked, her voice a warm rumble. I nodded eagerly. Nights at Grandma's were journeys to magical lands, each story more thrilling than the last. But tonight, I craved a different kind of story, a different kind of excitement. "Can you tell me a scary story tonight, Grandma?" I blurted out. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, followed by a thoughtful pause. Unlike her usual repertoire of action-packed adventures, her stories have always steered clear of scary ones. She sat beside me on the patchwork quilt, her usual mischievous eyes replaced by a thoughtful gaze. Her eyes flickered towards the window for a moment before returning to me. Then, with a gentle smile, she began. "Those woods outside your window," she started, her voice a warm rumble. I instinctively glanced towards the window, the familiar silhouette of the trees outlined across the lake. "There's something in those woods," she continued, her voice dropping to a hushed whisper. A shiver danced down my spine, though the room remained pleasantly warm. Those simple words made me so uncomfortable that I was tempted to just tell Grandma to stop, but the truth was, I was hooked. Grandma did tell me scary stories on rare occasions, but they were always fictional, completely disconnected from the real world. She continued, "Every 7 years, it comes out of those woods, it emerges, a creature that's been on this earth for thousands of years, it crawls on all fours. It hunts, a silent predator searching for its prey." I began to tense up a little. The room remained quiet, but the air felt heavy. "Its body is like a man, but twisted and contorted," she murmured, "and its limbs elongated, reaching out at odd angles. Its skin is black as coal, making it difficult to spot during the night." I swallowed hard, my eyes instinctively drawn back to the window. The trees, once comforting, now seemed to writhe with unseen shadows. "But the worst part," she continued, her voice barely a tremor, "is its eyes, multiple eyes, scattered across its head like a spider. They pierce the darkness, searching for an unsuspecting victim." She continued, her voice a hushed whisper, sending shivers down my spine. "Sometimes, if it has trouble finding prey, it ventures closer, closer to houses, searching for unlocked windows." My breath caught in my throat. The image of eyes peering through the glass sent a jolt of terror through me. "If it finds an opening," she murmured, "it will crawl inside, and snatch the closest person to it, dragging them back to the woods." I squeezed my eyes shut, the warmth of the quilt a poor barrier against the sudden chill. "It keeps its victims alive for 7 long years," she whispered, "feeding off them slowly until the hunger returns, and it's time to hunt once more." My grip tightened on the blanket, and my knuckles were white. A cold sweat was dripping down my skin. "But don't you worry," she said, her voice gentling, "as long as we keep the windows locked, we'll be safe. And don't forget to do the same at your mom's house." She rose from the quilt, her smile strained at the edges. A smile meant to reassure, but one that couldn't hide the sliver of unease in her eyes. Her movements seemed slow and deliberate as she walked towards the window. My eyes followed her, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. She stared out of the window for a moment, as if checking to make sure the thing wasn't around, and then she checked to make sure the window was locked. Just as she was about to turn away, I blurted out, unable to contain the question that had lodged itself in my throat. "Grandma, have you ever seen it?" She paused for a few moments, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face before a reassuring smile crept onto her lips. She didn't answer me. She simply leaned down and kissed my forehead, a gesture filled with a strange intensity. "Good night, darling," she whispered. Then, with a gentle click, she shut my door behind her. I was awake for most of that night, staring at the darkened window pane. The familiar silhouette of the woods outside now held a new kind of terror. I kept wondering if I would see that face my grandma described, a face with multiple eyes staring back at me. Eventually, exhausted from fear and lack of sleep, my eyelids drifted shut, and I finally drifted off. While I slept, I dreamed of its form shifting and writhing in the darkness. I ran, my legs pumping, but it was like I was running on ice. Panic seized me as the figure lunged, its long arms wrapping around my legs. It dragged me, a ragdoll, through the grass, the stench of damp grass filling my nostrils. The woods grew bigger as the thing dragged me there, its jagged edges threatening to devour me whole. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Just as the branches of the trees were about to engulf me, I jolted awake, gasping for breath. Light streamed through the window, painting familiar shapes on the ceiling. The room held a peaceful stillness. It took several deep breaths to slow the pounding of my heart. Relief washed over me, chasing away the lingering dread. Since that night, despite Grandma's steady stream of new stories, the creature in the woods has remained a constant shadow in the corner of my mind. Thankfully, the nightmares, those terrifying chases through endless woods, didn't last. Slowly, the story faded from memory. A few years later, a different kind of darkness descended upon our family. Cancer, a cruel, selfish thief, stole my grandmother's health bit by bit. She fought for months, but in the end, the disease won. It left a hole in our lives, especially for Grandpa. Now, he lives alone, the silence of the house heavy with her absence. Talking about her seems to bring a fresh wave of pain etched deep into the lines on his face. Sometimes, he murmurs about just waiting for his turn to join her. It's a heartbreaking sight, a man transformed into a solitary figure, simply waiting to die. That year was a blur of grief, a dark tunnel we all had to navigate. But with the love and support of family and friends, we eventually managed to pull through. With each passing year, the grief lessened, but Grandma's memory remained. Then, after another few years, during my senior year in high school, something happened. I walked into the house after a long day. The familiar scent of an empty house greeted me. Mom had already left for work. Pulling my backpack onto my bed, I pulled out my books and settled in for an evening of homework, studying, and the occasional break to watch TV. I shut off the TV, changed into my pajamas, and crawled into bed. Sleep, however, remained elusive. My mind was a tangled mess, tossing and turning over the events of the day. Finally, I peeked at the clock on my desk, its green glow reading almost 3 a.m. Just then, a sound shattered the silence, a sharp tap that echoed through the room. My eyes flew open, snapping towards the window. A wave of ice washed over me, freezing my blood solid. Memories of Grandma's story flooded back, the creature, the woods. There, pressed against the glass, was a form that blocked most of the moonlight from filtering in. If not for the sliver of moonlight peeking in around what was blocking it, I wouldn't have been able to see it at all. Its human-shaped body pressed against the window, and across its head, I could have sworn I saw movement, a flicker, like multiple tiny insects scurrying across its flesh. Then, a horrifying realization dawned on me. They weren't insects. They were eyelids. Eyelids flickering open and shut, scanning my room with frantic urgency. My breath hitched. Was this a dream? Just then, a shadowy limb, long and impossibly thin, snaked out towards the base of my window. Had I locked the window? The sickening sound of the window, as the glass began to slide up, hit my ears. Terror choked and screamed in my throat. There are woods behind my mom's house too, and a sickening realization dawned on me. This wasn't just a story. It was real, and it was here. Adrenaline surged through me, and my flight or fight responses kicked in. I threw myself out of bed in a desperate scramble. My feet pounded the floor as I bolted towards the door, flinging it open, but my escape was cut short. The door slammed shut in my face, the force of it throwing me backward. A strangled cry escaped my lips as a wave of terror washed over me. My body locked up, and every muscle seized in a silent scream. Somehow, it was now in my room, that fast, it was no longer at the window, it was now above me, above my door. One of its grotesquely long limbs, tipped with a hand like a spider's claw, pressed firmly against the door, pinning me inside. Another seemed contorted at an unnatural angle, its fingers splayed against the wall in a grotesque parody of a grip. The head, if you could call it that, twisted on its neck in a way that defied human anatomy, almost spinning completely around. A chorus of eyes locked onto me. Trapped and alone, I stumbled back, my mind scrambling for any flicker of hope. The second floor was an escape route, but a leap out the window would likely result in injury, leaving me in a vulnerable position. Besides, that's where it probably wanted me. Right next to the door stood my wooden baseball bat. In a desperate lunge, I grabbed it, the wood rough against my grip. With a yell, I swung the bat with all my strength, connecting with a sickening thud. Splinters of wood rained down as the impact sent a tremor through the room. The creature recoiled slightly, its multiple eyes flickering in what might have been surprise. But the silence that followed was the most unsettling part. No roar of pain, no growl, this thing moved with an unnatural quiet. Even as it moved, it made no noise. It descended to the floor, its grotesque form dwarfing the space in my room. As it loomed closer, lowering its body in a predatory crouch, I swung the mangled bat wildly. The bat connected with a sickening thud, splintering wood raining down as the blow landed. The creature recoiled, its grotesque form momentarily faltering. Seizing my chance, I bolted past the thing, flung open the bedroom door, and slammed it shut behind me with a resounding bang. Adrenaline pumping, I raced down the stairs, each step echoing in the sudden silence. Reaching the living room, I fumbled for the light switch, illuminating the space with a warm glow. Panting, I gripped the broken bat like a lifeline, its splintered end pointed towards the top of the stairs, towards the thing in my room. Suddenly, a new sound pierced the tense silence, the creak of the front door opening. A silhouette emerged from the doorway, the dim porch light casting long shadows across her face. "There you are." My mom's voice, laced with exhaustion. "What the hell are you?" The sentence died on her lips, completely cut short. Her eyes widened, but neither she nor I had time to react. In a sharp and quick moment, a shadowy, distorted limb, tipped with a spidery claw, shot out, wrapping around my mother's waist. It snagged her, sinking its talons deep into her flesh, a sickening tear echoing in the sudden silence. A strangled noise bubbled in her throat, cut short before it could form a scream. But then, I heard her scream fully formed as the thing dragged her away to the woods. I ran with all my effort, but the thing was fast, too fast. All I could do was keep running, watching, as my mom screamed with her arms folded around the creature's arm in a desperate attempt to escape. It had her, though, exactly where it wanted her, out in the open. I fell face first into the grass, a sob wrenching its way out of my chest. Warm tears streamed down my face, blurring my vision as I watched in horror. Mom's screams turned into blood-curdling shrieks, fading into a horrifying silence as they disappeared into the indistinguishable maw of the woods. The police came, but what could they do? What could I tell them? I told them exactly what I saw. They looked at me like I was crazy, but what else could I say? For hours, I sat in a sterile interrogation room, the harsh overhead light blurring my vision. They questioned me over and over, dissecting my story, searching for inconsistencies. But all I could do was repeat the horrifying scene, my voice cracking with each retelling. There was no evidence to tie me to my mom's disappearance, nothing but my frantic pleas and the raw terror etched onto my face. Finally, they seemed to reach a reluctant roadblock. With a sigh and a dismissive glance, they released me. Now, a search party combs the backyard, venturing into the dense woods behind our house. Bloodhounds sniff the damp earth, their mournful howls echoing through the trees. In my room, the silence pressing down on me like a physical weight. As the harsh light of dawn breaks, I stare at the window. A large handprint, a grotesque, splayed imprint of multiple fingers, clings to the outside of the glass. A cold realization settles over me. Now I know that at least one of my grandma's stories is real. Most of our calls are for pretty run-of-the-mill things like wasp nests in attics or raccoons living in the walls. That being said, Orion is considered a specialty pest control provider due to the services we offer for atypical or unrecognized pests. Those terms may seem vague at the moment, but I promise they'll make more sense in a second. A general rule of thumb if you think that you're dealing with an unidentified animal is that salt repels most things. Not everything, but most things. Ground-up white eggshells can be used as well if you're environmentally conscious. I try to use them when I can, but salt is more readily available. Administering a line of salt to doors and windows, especially windows facing the west, is normally the first course of action we recommend to clients who are concerned about potential infestations from the unknown sorts of critters. However, if you believe that there is an infestation already taking place, it's also possible to use the salt to try to contain the pest until someone is able to remove it. With that being said, sometimes more aggressive action is necessary when dealing with an atypical pest. On that note, here's a little PSA from your friendly neighborhood pest control specialist. Avoid coming into contact with any deer, raw venison, or cervine fecal material for a while. I know that most people don't feel inclined to play with deer crap to begin with, but yins would be amazed at the insane things I've seen grown adults do. And unfortunately, many of those insane things were, indeed, scat-related. Anyways, we received a call from a client claiming that her dog was attacked by a doe, of all things. Typically, we don't have to deal with deer since they tend to avoid humans. Normally, that's the Department of Wildlife's area of authority, but something was clearly off about this one. Initially, I was thinking that it had chronic wasting disease, since one of the symptoms noted in affected animals is that they no longer become skittish around humans. The client was, understandably, frantic on the phone. It just came up and bit my dog. And now it's in my yard. It won't leave. I swear, it's waiting for us to come back out. CWD is essentially deer Alzheimer's, so attacks from affected deer are typically brought about by confusion on the poor, dying animal's part. That prompted me to ask the client about how the deer looked. If it was emaciated, that would be a dead giveaway. She said its stomach was bulging, like it was pregnant. It was apparently watching her and her frightened doggie through the window, drooling. The distended stomach gave me pause. That wasn't usual for CWD. Thankfully, it was a slow day, so I was able to get over there as soon as possible. Before I left, I called one of the guys from the Department of Wildlife, knowing that they'd want to hear about it, especially if this was some sort of deer disease that could be going around. The officer said that he and his partner would take a look, but they was going to arrive a bit after me. No problem there. When possible, we live trap the pests that we are called out for. That being said, some of these unidentified animals can be extremely dangerous, which is why a firearm, a container of salt, and a knife with a silver blade are required to be on us for every call, even if it appears to be something harmless. Appearances can be deceiving. My boss learned that the hard way once. As such, the salt and knife stay on my tool belt at all times. We do also have a tranquilizer gun for larger animals, which I thought would be useful for the deer. When I first got there, I didn't see the doe, so I circled around to the backyard, tranq gun at the ready. An expensive-looking swing set shaped like a castle stood like a colorful fortress, the chains squeaking as they swayed in the wind. A few yards away, the deer snorted at me, its hoofs stomping at the ground. The animal's fur was disheveled. Its ears were drawn back close to its head. Foamy strings of drool hung from the corners of its mouth, the white patch of fur on its neck slick from the excessive salivation. Whether it was CWD or something else, this deer was definitely sick. Best not to get near it. I shot it with the tranq gun. It let out a small grunt of alarm, taking a few ungainly steps towards me. I stepped back, trying to keep my distance until the animal could be knocked out. It shuddered, mouth open like it was about to vomit. At first, I thought the pink thing in its mouth was the doe's tongue, but then more appeared. Long tendrils unfurled from its throat, stretching along the grass towards me, a loud crack echoing in my ears as the deer's jaw snapped. The deer's body convulsed violently, its bloated stomach rapidly shrinking as these abhorrent things slithered out of its mouth. My stomach lurched at the sight. I let out an extremely professional-sounding whimper as I booked it for the swing set. Something you should know about me is that I have a phobia of worms. Snakes? Spiders? Rats? No problem. But for some reason, worms make my skin crawl. The deer had fallen to the ground, the poor animal still alive and quaking as its body was dragged by the worms crawling out of its throat across the lawn, inching towards me. A low, pained noise came from the deer each time that it was jerked along. Once I pulled myself into the swing set's tower, I took aim at the deer's head with my rifle and fired. Blood and gray matter splashed across the yard. The worms twitched, thrashing around like jump ropes wielded by particularly aggressive toddlers. I shrank back, grimacing, becoming slightly nauseous when I looked a little too closely at where they protruded at what was left of the deer's open mouth. I fired again. The worms jolted from the impact, their thrashes becoming more lethargic as their host died. The ropey bodies slowed their convulsing down to mere twitches until they eventually were limp on the ground, fanned out in separate directions along the grass. I watched the worms warily, not convinced that they weren't going to suddenly start writhing again. Gingerly, I reached for the salt, wondering if I should go down and pour it on the worms. Make sure that they were actually dead. All I had to do was go down there, where they were. Worms roughly the length and width of human intestines. Worms that appeared to have taken over the body of a deer. Fuck me. With a deep breath, I reluctantly slid down the slide to get down from the tower. With how tall I am, I scooted only a tiny bit before the soles of my boots touched the ground. My jaw clenched in anticipation. I got to my feet quickly as one of the worms weakly squirmed, trying fruitlessly to get nearer to me. I was close enough to see now that it had a round, jawless mouth edged by rows upon rows of small, sharp teeth. Ugh! Resisting the urge to flinch away, I lifted the lid of the salt, then dumped it on the horrible creature. It began its thrashing anew, and I jumped back, preparing to run back onto the swing set like the big hero that I am, but thankfully, the worm seemed to be in its death throes. After its last bout of writhing, its movements finally ceased. Oh, thank God! I repeated this process with the other ones until they were all immobile. By the time I was done, I was shaky, trying to regain my composure. I promise, I'm not this squeamish about most of the things we deal with. It's just worms that get to me. And even then, I still get it done. I waited until the wildlife guys showed up to knock on the client's door. Truthfully, my hands were still shaking a bit since my adrenaline was wearing off, so I kept them in my pockets. I didn't want her to get even more freaked out than she already was, especially with the news I was about to give her. I informed her that the deer's body was being taken by the Department of Wildlife to run tests, advising her to take her dog to the vet to check for any signs that the worms may have infected it. Her face paled. Worms? Unfortunately, yes. I replied, resisting a shudder as I recalled their rows of teeth against my will. I don't know how these species of parasites spread, so just to be safe, have your dog checked. The Department of Wildlife is going to take over from here. They'll be able to give you more information once they've examined the deer a bit. Before I left, I discovered that the wildlife guys were just as disturbed by the worms as I was. One officer said that he'd never seen anything like it. They planned to take the doe's body for testing and said that they'd let both the client and me know if they found anything out. Later that evening, I received a call from the Department of Wildlife. They wanted to know exactly what I did to kill the worms. I told them, growing concerned. The client's dog was being quarantined after the vet found strange readings in its blood work. That made my blood chill. The client and her family were also being advised to visit a doctor in case any of them also came into contact with any infected biological material. The wildlife officer advised me to do the same. They weren't sure if the worms could infect humans, but since it had potentially crossed the species barrier by infecting our client's labradoodle, they recommended extreme caution. I didn't think I came into contact with the worms, but I know better than to mess around with things like this. Even though my doctor assured me in my initial assessment that everything seemed normal, I was convinced that any minor twinge in my body was a worm squirming around in my guts while I waited for my test results. In the end, everything came back normal. Good. I don't think I am emotionally or psychologically equipped to deal with massive worms growing inside of me. Unfortunately, the dog wasn't so lucky. It's not dead, don't worry. It just had to deal with numerous anti-helminth medications until the vets found one that was effective. Thankfully, it's alive and back to its enviable life as a spoiled labradoodle, but I guess the poor thing is more skittish than it used to be. Can't say I blame it. It was good to know this parasite is treatable, as long as it's caught early enough. Granted, it isn't clear how long that window is open for. Hours? Days? Weeks? According to the officer I spoke to, it was difficult to tell how long the doe was infected for. Meanwhile, the dog had only been bitten a few hours prior to needing aggressive anti-worm treatment. They must spread and grow pretty fast. That gives me the impression that the treatment window must be pretty small. When I mentioned atypical organisms earlier, things like those worms were what I meant. They're merely animals that haven't been identified yet. We get a lot of them around here. Not parasitic worms, thank God. I need a career change if that were the case. I mean on critters in general. Not all of them are hostile, either. Like with any animal, most of the time, it all depends on how you treat them. Take the housekeepers, for example. While I was still waiting to get my blood tests from the worm incident back, I had a call from a client that started with, "Hey, I called the police, but they told me to talk to you, for some reason. Someone has been breaking into my house and cleaning it." They haven't taken anything, which is weird. I don't know what some rat catchers would know about that. I rolled my eyes. We don't have any shortage of uppity suburban pricks like this who think that their silly little office jobs make them superior to everyone else. Some rat catchers. Despite my irritation, when I spoke, I was professional. Have you or anyone else experienced any sensations like being pinched in the middle of the night? What kind of question is dash? He started to snap, but I guess his brain must have turned on because his tone suddenly changed. Actually, yes. What does that have to do with the thing in my house? I ignored his question. Have you found any broken glassware? Yes. How did you know that? Sounds like you have what we call a housekeeper. They tend to get a little feisty if their work isn't appreciated, so if you leave out some cream before you go to bed at night, the problem should stop. The client adopted his snippy attitude again. Is that supposed to be a joke? No, sir, I'm completely serious. If you leave the housekeeper the offering like I told you, it'll continue to clean your home without causing any more issues for you and your family. Can I speak to someone who actually knows what they're talking about? I was struggling to think of a reply that wasn't riddled with cuss words when a pale hand appeared in my face. When did the boss get in? And why did he look so awful? Was he sick? The boss flatly said, he wants to speak to the manager, doesn't he? Without another word, I handed him the phone. As the boss politely ripped the client a new one, I scanned him. He was always a pale guy to begin with, being Scandinavian, but he was even more pasty than usual, the permanent dark circles under his eyes even more pronounced. Another thing that stood out was that he had a bandana tied around his neck. An odd fashion choice for him. His arms were covered by the navy blue company jacket we all wore, so I couldn't check for what I truly needed to see. The client ended up hanging up on the boss. He shook his head, grumbling as he set the phone back in its cradle. Be prepared for this asshole to call back in a few days. I followed him into his office. Victor, is everything all right? The boss didn't look at me as he said, I'm as great as I usually am. That wasn't a good answer. I was about to press the issue when he muttered, I'm not using again. Don't worry about it, all right? Reluctantly, I nodded, then went back to my desk. I've known Victor for years. He'd open up when he was ready. Sure enough, the dickhead did end up calling back 3 days later. Wouldn't he know it? He didn't follow our advice. Now, the housekeeper was angry and somehow, that was our fault. Customer service, everybody. I dragged our new hire, Raina, along for this one to give her some experience. This was her first time seeing what happens when housekeepers are mistreated. I just prayed that it hadn't transformed. In case it hadn't, I took a container of fresh cream, hoping that a late offering would be enough to calm it. The client and his wife were cowering in a hotel, leaving the house entirely to us by giving us permission to use their hidden spare key. When we got inside, the place was wrecked. Broken glass littered the carpet and kitchen tiles. Cabinets were left wide open, empty during the housekeeper's tirade. The white couch looked as if it had been clawed. Family photos were ripped up on the floor. I told Raina to keep her container of salt handy. Wide-eyed, head swiveling to take in the state of the house, she obliged. It hasn't followed the family, which hopefully means that it hasn't transformed yet. I informed her. So what does that mean? She asked. That means it can still be reasoned with. I found a bowl that hadn't been smashed and poured the cream into it. I loudly announced that I had a gift for the housekeeper. Transformed housekeepers will still accept cream, they'll just try to pull your ears off afterwards. Anxiously, I waited to see what would come out. The floor above me creaked. Raina noticeably stiffened, looking at me for guidance, trying to emulate my body language. One thing I can pride myself on is that I'm decent at pretending to be more calm than I actually am in circumstances like this, worm incident aside. The footsteps descended the stairs, revealing the client's agitated house guest. The bipedal, humanoid creature couldn't have been much taller than 2 feet. Neatly combed, coarse brown hair covered its wrinkled body. Its brow was furrowed in a scowl, its lip curled in distaste as it showed off crooked, small teeth. Where it would have made sense for a nose to be was only a bony hole in its place. In summary, it hadn't transformed yet. Thank God. Disgruntled, the housekeeper stomped over to the bowl of cream, clutched it with both hands, and downed it in 2 gulps. The entire time, Rena watched with wide-eyed fascination. Once it was done, the housekeeper glared down at the table. It grumbled, "You got any Baileys, girl?" "I do not," I replied ruefully. "Shame. You be needin' Baileys, too, if you had to deal with these fucking people." Not wanting it to get angrier, I poured it some more cream. This time, it sipped gently at its offering, seeming to settle down some. When dealing with a housekeeper, it is important to always be polite. As such, I courteously asked the housekeeper if I could be excused for a brief moment to talk to Rena. He gruffly agreed. I whispered to her, "Stop staring at him. He'll consider that rude." Instantly, Rena looked away from him. I continued, "If you have to speak with the housekeeper, make sure you act like you're dealing with royalty. No smart-mouthing. And no matter what, do not smile or laugh in its presence. Don't tell your name, and don't ask for his. Understood?" She furrowed her brow at me, but didn't question me as she did what he was told, coming over to join us at the kitchen table. When I rejoined the housekeeper, I said mildly, "Your hosts have been ungracious." The housekeeper snorted, "No need to sugarcoat it, girl. Fucking ill-mannered, snot-nosed, layabout jackoffs is what I'd reckon they are." I nodded. He wasn't wrong. Rena, following my lead, did the same. Alls I ask for is a damn bowl o' cream at the end o' a long day's work, but these people wouldn't know a good day's work if it bit 'em on the arse. These is fucking wastes of air, I reckon. It carried on ranting and raving like that between sips of cream. Silently, I let it, making sure to keep my contact brief enough to avoid staring, but long enough that the housekeeper would know that I was properly paying attention to our one-sided conversation. The housekeeper's vocal rampaging continued. They couldn't even be bothered to be rid of me themselves. They sent 2 little girls to go and do it for him. Maybe I'll stay, just to spite him. Break some more of their precious china. Keeping my tone gentle, the same voice I use for young children and argumentative clients, I tried to de-escalate things, "But you're such a dedicated worker. Your talents are wasted on people like this. You deserve to be recognized for your efforts." The housekeeper sipped his cream thoughtfully. "You speak truths, girl." "Truths, they are." I waited patiently for him to finish his bowl of cream. Rena's eyes and mouth were tight with anxiety as the room quieted with the exception of the housekeeper gulping down his drink. Finally, he set the bowl down and declared, "I'll be seeking elsewhere. I'll seek the worthy." Internally, I breathed a sigh of relief. We wouldn't have to deal with a transformed housekeeper today. The 2 idiots that pissed it off won't go missing. Not like others who we couldn't get to in time. The client may be a prick, but I don't wish that upon him. I wouldn't wish that on anyone. Before we left, I had Rena help me line all of the house's entryways with salt. While I doubted the housekeeper would come back, I didn't want to leave it to chance. So, do you think our client was grateful? Take a guess. For whatever reason, the idiot thought we'd clean his house for him after we got rid of the housekeeper. He and Victor got into it over the phone and the client threatened to sue for something. Fuck her. Should have just let the housekeeper destroy the place. I chose these 2 cases for a few reasons, this first being that I want everyone to be aware of the deer parasites. Please, be careful out there. The second reason is that Orion operates only in a few counties in Pennsylvania and Ohio. While we can't help everyone, we can at least arm you all with information so that yins don't get in a bad situation with an unidentified animal. Just remember, when in doubt, salt. And if you awaken to find that your house is now suddenly spotless, be gracious. Do better than the idiot mentioned above.